3:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Ottawa, Canada. Every empire has a moment when the mask comes off. Not slowly, not gradually, not through years of quiet erosion that historians piece together decades later. One moment, one event, one revelation that strips away every carefully constructed lie and shows the world, shows the people, what their government actually is, what it actually thinks, what it actually says when it believes nobody is listening. For Nixon, it was the tapes. For the Soviet Union, it was Chernobyl. For the Bush administration, it was weapons of mass destruction that never existed. For the Trump administration, it was a black briefcase. At 3:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time this afternoon, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney held an emergency press conference in Ottawa. It lasted exactly 11 minutes. Not 12, not 10, 11 minutes, timed, controlled, surgical. And in those 11 minutes, he completely shattered what remained of the Trump administration's credibility. Not just in this crisis, not just on Canada policy, on everything. Because once you prove a government has been systematically lying to its own people, using their own documents, their own memos, their own words, the trust doesn't just break on one issue, it breaks on all of them. Carney appeared at the podium carrying a black leather briefcase. Camera flashes erupted. The room held its breath. And what he pulled out of it, what he held up to the cameras, what he read aloud in that calm, measured voice, represents the most damaging intelligence leak in the history of U.S.-Canada relations. Classified U.S. government documents, internal White House memos, Pentagon assessments, Treasury Department analyses, State Department cables, a transcript of a private conversation between the President of the United States and his Chief of Staff. Documents that prove, not allege, not suggest, not imply, prove that the Trump administration has been systematically lying to the American public, lying about the economic impact of the crisis, lying about Canada's willingness to negotiate, lying about the viability of U.S. retaliatory measures, and lying about what their own experts, their own hand-picked experts, have been telling them about who is winning this confrontation. This is not Carney making accusations. This is not opposition research. This is not spin. This is Carney presenting the United States government's own words, their own analysis, their own conclusions, their own unanimous recommendations, all ignored because one man's ego could not absorb the reality that he was wrong. The American people just learned that their government has been lying to them. U.S. allies just learned that American intelligence security has been compromised. And Donald Trump just learned that Canada has access to his administration's most sensitive internal deliberations. U.S. credibility didn't erode today. It didn't weaken. It didn't take a hit. It collapsed. And it collapsed in 11 minutes. In this breakdown, I'm going to walk you through the specific documents Carney revealed, every single one, and what they prove about the Trump administration's internal understanding of this crisis. I'm going to show you the immediate reaction from Washington and why officials are describing this as the worst intelligence breach since Edward Snowden. I'm going to explain how Canada obtained these classified U.S. documents and what that reveals about the catastrophic state of U.S. intelligence security. I'm going to reveal the specific lies that Trump administration officials have been telling. Lies that are now exposed as knowingly false, spoken with full awareness that the truth was the opposite. And I'm going to give you analysis of whether the U.S. government can maintain any credibility with allies, with the American public, or with Congress after this exposure. Subscribe to join the community, leave a comment so we can keep the conversation going, and share this video because what you're about to see is a government being undressed by its own paperwork, and the American people deserve to see every page. The briefcase. Let me walk you through what Carney actually revealed. Because each document pulled from that briefcase one by one, held up to the cameras and read aloud for the world, demolishes a specific Trump administration claim, one by one, methodically, completely. Carney opened the press conference by saying, "Over the past month, the Trump administration has made numerous public statements about this crisis. They have claimed that Canada is the aggressor. They have claimed that the United States has overwhelming leverage. They have claimed that Canada will eventually capitulate because we cannot survive without American markets. They have claimed that American economic interests are protected and that any damage from this crisis is minimal." Then came the line that turned the press conference into something else entirely. Every single one of those claims is a lie, and I can prove it using the United States government's own internal documents. And then he opened the briefcase. Document 1, the Treasury memo. The first document was a Treasury Department memo dated February 15, 2026, 2 weeks after the tariffs were imposed. It was titled Economic Impact Assessment Canada Trade Disruption. This was the U.S. government's own economic analysis, prepared by career economists at the Treasury Department and delivered directly to the president. Carney read from it. Sustained trade conflict with Canada will result in U.S. GDP contraction of 0.8% to 1.2% in 2026. That translates to roughly $224 billion to $336 billion in lost economic output. Next line. Job losses exceeding 400,000 in manufacturing and energy sectors. States most affected: Michigan, Ohio, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Then another projection. Consumer price increases of 3% to 5% due to supply chain disruptions. For the average American household, that meant between $2,400 and $4,000 more per year in living costs. This was what the president's own Treasury Department told him. GDP contraction. 400,000 jobs lost. Prices rising across the board. American families paying thousands more per year because of a trade war their president started. But the critical part of the memo came next. Canada's economy will also suffer, but Canada has demonstrated capacity to redirect exports to European and Asian markets, reducing Canadian dependence on U.S. buyers. The United States has no comparable alternatives for Canadian energy imports. And then the conclusion. Canada has superior leverage in any prolonged economic confrontation. Carney looked directly at the camera. That is the United States Treasury Department in February telling President Trump that Canada has superior leverage, yet President Trump has spent the last month claiming the opposite. Pause. He lied. The second document came from the Department of Defense, dated February 28, 2026, titled Strategic Impact, Potential NORAD Dissolution. This was the Pentagon telling the president exactly what would happen if Canada followed through on dissolving NORAD. Carney read the key sections. Dissolution of NORAD would create critical gaps in North American air defense, particularly in Arctic early warning capabilities. Canadian radar installations and air bases, the memo said, are essential for detecting aerial threats approaching from northern vectors. Essential. Not helpful. Not useful. Essential. Without Canadian cooperation, the United States cannot adequately defend its own northern airspace. Then came the financial assessment. Loss of Canadian cooperation would require the United States to invest an estimated $40 billion to $60 billion over 5 to 7 years to build comparable independent capabilities. $40 to $60 billion and 5 to 7 years. During those years, the Pentagon warned, the United States would face significantly degraded ability to detect and respond to airborne threats. And finally, the Pentagon's explicit recommendation. NORAD must be preserved. Accepting Canadian terms for continued cooperation is strategically essential. Carney paused. The Pentagon told President Trump that losing NORAD is strategically unacceptable and that he must accept Canada's terms. Yet President Trump continues to threaten NORAD as if it is leverage he holds over Canada. He lied. If you want, I can continue with part 2. Document 3, 4, 5 plus, the transcript plus Washington meltdown. Next, so you get the entire cleaned script exactly like this. Yes, below is part 2 of your script converted into plain narration, continuing from document 3. All formatting markers and cues have been removed while keeping the wording intact. Document 3, the State Department cable. Document 3 was a State Department cable dated March 4, 2026. It was sent from the U.S. ambassador to NATO to the Secretary of State. This was America's own diplomat, stationed at NATO headquarters, reporting back to Washington on what America's allies actually thought about the dispute. Carney read from the cable. All NATO members contacted regarding the U.S.-Canada dispute have expressed support for Canada's position. All, not most, not a majority. All. 30 allied governments had been contacted. Every single one sided with Canada. The cable continued. Multiple allies have privately indicated they view U.S. actions as a violation of alliance principles and will not support the U.S. position in any NATO forum. Violation of alliance principles. In diplomatic language, that is an extremely serious accusation. Then another line. The Alternative Security Partnership Fund proposed by Canada has received enthusiastic support from 23 NATO members. 23 of the 31 members of the NATO alliance had already expressed support for Canada's proposal. And then the cable's conclusion. U.S. diplomatic isolation on this issue is complete. Complete. The ambassador did not say significant. He did not say concerning. He said complete. The cable ended with a recommendation. The United States should accept Canada's demands immediately to prevent permanent damage to alliance relationships. Carney looked up from the document. The State Department told President Trump on March 4th that U.S. diplomatic isolation is complete and that he should accept Canada's demands. Instead, he sent a partial compliance proposal that Canada rejected. He lied about having allied support. 3 documents, 3 different departments of the U.S. government, Treasury, Pentagon, State Department, and every one of them contradicted what the president had been telling the public. The kill shot. Then Carney said something that changed the tone of the entire press conference. This next document is the most important, because this document did not just expose inaccurate statements. It exposed the internal decision-making of the Trump administration. Document 4, the NSC Decision Memo. Document 4 was a National Security Council memo dated March 8, 2026. The title was Decision Memo, Response Options to Canadian Ultimatum. This memo laid out 3 options for the president. Option 1, full compliance with Canada's 5 requirements. The memo stated that this option would immediately end the crisis, restore trade relations, and restore security cooperation. But it also acknowledged the political cost. It would represent a public humiliation for the president. Option 2, partial compliance with compromise proposals. The memo warned that Canada had already stated partial compliance would be rejected. If this option were chosen, Canada would likely implement Phase 2 retaliation. Option 3, refusal to comply, followed by retaliatory measures against Canada. The memo's assessment was blunt. The United States has no effective retaliatory measures available. Any U.S. retaliation would likely be countered by the coalition of nations supporting Canada, resulting in deeper U.S. isolation and greater economic damage. And then came the recommendation. All 3 National Security Council principals, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the Director of National Intelligence, unanimously recommended Option 1, full compliance with Canada's demands. The memo stated clearly, full compliance with Canadian demands is the only option that serves U.S. national interests. It acknowledged that the political cost to the president would be significant, but it also stated that the economic and strategic costs of refusing compliance would be catastrophic. It concluded with one final sentence. The president must accept Canada's terms immediately. Carney paused after reading that line. That memo was written 3 days ago. President Trump's own national security team told him unanimously that he must accept Canada's terms. Instead, he continues to claim he is winning and that Canada will back down. He is ignoring his own advisors. Document 5. The transcript. Then Carney removed one final document from the briefcase. He said quietly, "This final document is the most revealing. It was not an analysis. It was not a memo. It was a transcript of a private conversation between President Trump and his chief of staff on March 9th, the day after Canada rejected the partial compliance proposal." Carney read from the transcript. The chief of staff began the conversation. "Mr. President, every expert is telling us we need to accept Canada's demands. Treasury says we're losing economically. Pentagon says we're losing strategically. State says we're losing diplomatically. We have no allies supporting us. We have no leverage. We need to end this before March 18th, Trump responded. "I don't care what the experts say. I'm not surrendering to Canada." The chief of staff continued trying to persuade him. "Sir, Treasury estimates GDP contraction. Hundreds of thousands of jobs. Our allies are siding with Canada. The Pentagon says losing NORAD cooperation weakens our defenses. Trump interrupted. I don't care if it crashes the economy. Another pause. I don't care if we lose allies. Then the line that would echo across the world within minutes. I will not be humiliated by Mark Carney. The chief of staff tried one final time. Sir, Canada isn't going to break. They have alternatives. We don't, Trump replied. Then we go down fighting. Go. And then the final sentence. I'd rather destroy the economy than admit I was wrong. When Carney finished reading the transcript, the room in Ottawa fell completely silent. Reporters did not shout questions. No one moved because there was nothing left to interpret. The President of the United States had stated in his own words that he would rather destroy the American economy than admit a mistake. Carney closed the document. The American people deserve to know the truth about how decisions affecting their lives are being made. He placed the documents back in the briefcase. Then he said one final sentence. These documents are now public. Within minutes of the press conference ending, the documents began circulating across every major news organization in the world. By the time the first hour had passed, Washington was already in crisis mode. At 4:15 p.m., the White House held an emergency press briefing. Reporters immediately asked whether the documents released by Canada were authentic. The press secretary responded carefully. We do not comment on allegedly leaked classified materials. It was not a denial. If the documents were fake, the White House would have said they were fake. Instead, they described them as classified materials. That alone told reporters what they needed to know. The documents were real. A reporter then asked whether the transcript of the president saying he would rather destroy the economy than admit he was wrong was accurate. The press secretary did not answer directly. The president is committed to protecting American interests, she said. Another reporter pressed the question again. Did the president say those words? The press secretary ended the briefing and walked out of the room. The microphones were still live as reporters shouted questions after her. The White House had nothing left to say. At 5:00 p.m., the FBI and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released a joint statement. The unauthorized disclosure of classified national security information is a serious crime. We are working to identify the source of this leak and will prosecute anyone involved to the fullest extent of the law. In trying to threaten whoever leaked the documents, the government had confirmed something important. The information was classified, which meant the documents were authentic. At 5:45 p.m., the president posted on Truth Social, the so-called documents released by Canada are fake, created by Canadian intelligence to make me look bad. Nothing in those documents is real. This is election interference by a foreign government. Canada will pay a severe price for this. The problem was obvious. An hour earlier, the FBI and DNI had confirmed they were investigating the leak of classified information. If the documents were fake, there would be nothing to leak. The president's own government had contradicted him. At 6:30 p.m., the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee held a press conference. I have reviewed the documents released by Canada. Based on my knowledge of how classified materials are structured and distributed, I assess that these documents appear authentic. He continued, if these documents are authentic, then the administration has been systematically misleading Congress and the American people about the Canada crisis. He announced that the Intelligence Committee would hold emergency hearings. The goal would be to determine three things: what the administration knew, when they knew it, and why they told the public something different. At 7:15 p.m., something unusual happened. The Senate Majority Leader and the Senate Minority Leader issued a joint statement. If the documents released today are authentic, then the president has been ignoring the unanimous advice of his national security team while publicly claiming the opposite. They called on the president to accept Canada's 5 requirements immediately and end the crisis before the March 18th deadline. It was a rare moment of bipartisan unity, but it was also a warning. At 8:00 p.m., reports began emerging that multiple senior administration officials had resigned. The resignations were not confirmed immediately, but several major news organizations reported that at least 3 senior officials had submitted letters of resignation within hours of the press conference. According to people familiar with the situation, the officials told colleagues they could not continue serving in an administration that ignored expert advice and misled the public. One official reportedly said privately, "I cannot serve a president who would rather destroy the country than admit a mistake." By 9 p.m., polling data was already emerging. A rapid national poll found that 71% of Americans believed the documents released by Canada were authentic. 68% believed the administration had been lying about the crisis. And 73% believed the president should accept Canada's demands before the March 18th deadline. In a country as politically divided as the United States, numbers like that are extremely rare. The president had not only lost the diplomatic fight, he had lost the public. How did Canada get the documents? One question began circulating immediately among intelligence analysts. How did Canada obtain these documents? There were three possible explanations. The first possibility was human sources. Someone inside the U.S. government with access to classified information may have leaked the documents directly to Canadian intelligence. If that was the case, it would mean individuals inside the government believed the policy was dangerous enough to justify risking prosecution. The second possibility was cyber intelligence. Canadian intelligence services, possibly working with allies, may have intercepted or accessed U.S. communication systems. If that were true, it would indicate a serious vulnerability in American cybersecurity. The third possibility involved intelligence sharing. Some analysts suggested that another allied intelligence service might have obtained the information through its own surveillance capabilities and passed it to Canada. Any of these scenarios would represent a major intelligence failure. If Canada had access to these conversations, analysts began asking a much more troubling question. If Canada could access them, who else could? 7 days, 2 futures. The press conference did not end the crisis. It changed it. 7 days remained before the March 18th deadline. From that moment forward, there were only 2 possible outcomes. The first scenario was rapid political collapse. Under this scenario, the documents would destroy the president's remaining support. Members of Congress from both parties would demand immediate compliance with Canada's requirements. Legislation could be introduced forcing the administration to meet those requirements. With bipartisan support, such legislation could pass with veto-proof majorities. The crisis would end before the deadline. Trade would resume. Security cooperation would be restored. But the political damage to the presidency would be enormous. Investigations would begin immediately. Congress would examine whether the administration had misled lawmakers about the crisis. The Intelligence Committee would investigate the leak. And a new question would begin circulating in Washington. If a president ignores unanimous national security advice and knowingly misleads the public, does that constitute grounds for removal from office? The second scenario was far more dangerous. In this scenario, the president would refuse to capitulate. Despite the documents, despite congressional pressure, despite the polls, he would double down. March 18th would arrive without compliance. Canada would implement the next phase of its response. Energy exports would stop. Security cooperation would end. Financial decoupling would begin. Within days, the economic and diplomatic consequences would escalate dramatically. Under those conditions, Washington could face something it had not experienced in generations, a full constitutional crisis. The cabinet could be forced to consider the 25th Amendment. Congress might attempt emergency legislation to override presidential authority on trade and foreign policy. The United States would be facing internal political turmoil at the same time it was facing external economic pressure. All because of a single decision, a refusal to say 3 words, "I was wrong." What happened in Ottawa was not just a press conference, it was an exposure. 5 documents, 11 minutes, and a government's credibility collapsed. The documents showed that every major department inside the U.S. government had advised the president to accept Canada's terms. They showed that the administration knew the economic consequences. They showed that the diplomatic isolation was already complete. And they revealed that the president had privately acknowledged those facts, but refused to act. Because admitting a mistake would be humiliating. 7 days remained before the deadline. The documents were public. The truth was known. And the only remaining question was whether the American political system would act before the clock ran out. The countdown had begun. 7 days, and nowhere left to hide.